So welcome everybody. We have the great pleasure to welcome Lydia Davis among us. Thank you so much, Lydia, for having accepted to talk with us and for joining us today. John Evans will moderate the session. So John, we're listening to you, and you will ask the first questions.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Jean-Michel. And thank you, Lydia, for joining us. So what I plan to do is ask 2 or 3 questions to get started and to give people a chance to think of their own questions, although from the sessions this morning and this afternoon, there's plenty of questions that people have to ask. And then what I'll do is I will keep an eye on the chat, but if you want to ask questions, please use the raise hand function of Zoom. So you go down to participants and it should be there. If you click on participant, there should be an option to raise hand. Or put it in the chat saying, I want to ask a question, and I'll come back to you.
Will it be possible for me to see people when they ask a question, or is everybody...
If they turn their cameras on, they should appear there. So
they don't have to if they don't want to, but it's sometimes nice to see the face.
Yes. Yeah, I was going to say that's what we always say to students. It's nice to see you when we're talking to you. Okay, so I'm going to start with a few of these questions. And I really just thought I'd go in nice and easy. So what have you been reading recently?
Oh, you think that's easy? The trouble is I read many, many, many books at the same time. So it's gotten, I think during this strange time, I've sort of alternated between serious nonfiction and then good but escapist fiction. So there's an Anglo-Irish writer named Mal Keane from the last century, 19th century. No, I'm sorry, 20th century, yeah, who's quite good. So that's the last fiction I read. Then next to my bed, I've had 3 books piled up, which is worse than my 2 books, meaning I dip into all 3 at night. That's gotten a little ridiculous. One of them is Caste by Isabel Wilkerson. Later in the year, I'll be reading The Warmth of Other Suns about the Great Migration of African Americans from the South. And then Caste is really an overview of going beyond racism to the idea of caste in different cultures. As you probably know, I mean, that book is getting a lot of attention. And then kind of paired with it is James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. And even though it isn't long, it's I read only a little bit of it at a time. So those were 2 recent ones. And then I just started and just to get away from all that for a little bit. As I say, I go in and out of books. I picked up Jeffrey Household's Watcher in the Shadows. I'm having trouble remembering some of these, but that's from the 1960s, a very gripping thriller sort of thing about the Second World War. I don't know if I'll go on with that either, but I keep sampling. I'm a restless reader at the moment.
Okay, thank you for that. So I was going to ask about your work. And so with the fact that Essays 2 is coming out soon, that means that you've now published 2 quite large volumes of essays, as well as, you know, the short story collections and the pile of translations. So I wanted to ask you, which genre do you like writing most? If you can think of it in those terms, or how do you feel about each of the different genres that you write in?
Well, I can start with what I like least. And because most of the writing I do, I enjoy. So fiction and nonfiction. But what is most difficult for me is, say, the introduction to the Léry's translation, the latest Léry's volume, that Michel Léry's, the third volume of The Rules of the Game. And there I felt obligated to write a very complete introduction, very informative, really rounding up material about his life and about critical studies of him, and where these works fit in his oeuvre, and so on and so forth. And that's not what I'm very good at. I'm really not a scholar of that sort of thing. So I do my best. I read people who know more than I do, and so I only bring in my own ideas maybe toward the end of that, and my own experience meeting him, and that part I enjoy. The other part I feel a little bit like an undergraduate with a very tough professor and a very tough exam coming up. So, but all the rest, I mean, I enjoy very much, say, in the essays, let's see, in the ones with a more free floating or free form. So in the first book of essays, there was a long essay about Flaubert and translation, which I wrote in small sections. And so there I could bring in my own observations, but also add in interesting tidbits from this commentator or that writer talking about translation. Henry James, what he said about Flaubert, and then what he said again about Flaubert. And that is fun for me. That I thoroughly enjoy. But I suppose really the stories are what I come back to. I mean, those are what come most naturally. So I guess that sort of sums it up. I started with what is difficult for me. I hope I don't have to. I'm going to have to do a little more of that, but I'm trying to keep it to a minimum.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you very much for that, Lydia. I want to follow that up with a question about translation. After, as you were talking about the Léry's, I mean, and my question is, when you look back over your translations, which is the one that you feel most proud of, or the one that you feel happiest with as you look back as a translator or as a writer on them?
Let's see, if I really look back, there are a lot of them. It's hard. I would think of the Proust first, Du Côté de chez Swann, and then Madame Bovary, but that's because I worked the hardest on them and probably learned the most and was the most thorough. And but it's very hard. I've also been very delighted by much shorter translations. There's a Swiss writing in German named Peter Bichsel, Bichsel. I've done just a few of his stories, but I'm delighted by the stories, and it's an adventure to translate them. And then there's a Dutch A.L. Snijders, again, very short stories. That's sort of my resolution, to do only very short stories from now on, if I can. And his stories are also delightful, and it's also an adventure because I'm not so deeply well read in Dutch, or not at all, really. They'll be coming out in a book in the fall also from New Directions, the stories of Snijders. But I think the Proust, it's just that what you're left with when you try something like the Proust, more so that than Madame Bovary, is the feeling that you didn't quite get it. You didn't quite do it. in some ultimately perfect way. You know, one sentence may be absolutely the way you want it and you're delighted with it, but there'll be another sentence that's a compromise, or that's a little stiff, or that's, you know, doesn't quite do what is really impossible to do, you know, have it very close and accurate, but also very lively English. I mean, that's tough.
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Okay, I want to open the floor at this stage. So I know Ahmed has been waiting a while with her hand up. So do you want to open the questions from the floor, please, Ahmed?
Yes, please.
I'm ready.
And the great Davis at last. I'm raising my hand in the hope of hoping I could reach your extra hand, Lydia Davis. I think I know you very well, thanks to the immediacy of your texts. My question is, you tend to hold a dialogue, not only with other writers' works, but within your own work itself. Sometimes within the work, with other texts. For example, in Varieties of Disturbance, the text that is entitled A Study of Get-Well Letters from a Class of Fourth Graders, you give the reader a clue to the interpretation of other texts within the same collection, like reflecting on the verb think. And I was intrigued by the word think in the very first text in the volume, a man from her past. I think mother is having a relationship with a man from her past. So my question is about the ordering of texts in your collection, Varieties of Disturbance. For example, the story Varieties of Disturbance is not the first story in the collection. It comes midway. I wonder if there is some rationale for ordering the texts in the collection, and if this kind of order is latent somewhere in the subconscious. How have you put them in order? The different texts with different lengths and different types. Why are they ordered this way?
Thank you. And I like your idea that one story might give a clue to how to read some of the other stories. It's a very complex process in a way. There's no easy way to, especially when I have a lot of stories, say 50 something or more. I guess the first book was 30 something, and then some are 50 something and some are more. And sometimes I just want to throw up my hands and, you know, have them be alphabetical and think it really doesn't matter. But what I tend to do is, as you can imagine, I want the first few to be very, usually quite short and very arresting, you know, very, very, not challenging, but just bright, vivid, strong. And the same sort of with the end, maybe taper off with shorter ones that are also solid and maybe even a little, sometimes I'm tempted to be a little elegiac at the end, or have a death one at the end, or an end one at the end. And then it's sort of like making a concert of classical music, you know, right after the intermission, you'll have the most important piece or something longer and more famous or fuller or more challenging. So I wouldn't put a difficult story. Some stories are difficult, you know, you have to read them slowly and maybe you get impatient or bored. So those I would put later in the book, say 2/3 of the way through. And maybe right after the middle, I'd have a longer one, just one that takes more time to read. And then I sort of Sometimes a collection has different categories, like letters of complaint or dream stories. You know, the different collections have sometimes different categories, and then I would try to group a few of those together. And I keep thinking of the French word parsemer. You know, have them sort of seeded through the collection, just grouped in little clusters. And then the last thing I have to do is see how one story transitions to the next. You know, are these two side by side too similar, or is the end of that too much like the beginning of the next one? So I don't do it so much as you might think that, you know, as you started by saying that I plant an important idea at the beginning or in the middle. I really don't tend to think about the ideas in the stories so much as the way they're written and the rhythm of them and the form of them, the pattern of them, the pace of them when I'm putting the book together. I'll probably get off the Zoom and think, oh, I forgot this or that. That's important when I put the collection together, but that's what I'm thinking of at the moment.
But thematically speaking, there is no rationale even in the subconscious for ordering them this way. For example, the first story, A Man from Her Past, gave me like a hint as to the irony in all the other stories, the confusion between an old reality and a new one. And I could see this confusion in every text in the collection. This kind of disturbed perception of self and others.
Well,
confusion.
I would think that, you know, partly just because it's one author for the whole book, you're going to see similar themes and preoccupations coming up again and again. And you might be quite right that subconsciously I wanted to start with that strong story because it set the theme for the rest. So it's possible.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I'm pleased and honored to have you with us.
Well, with both hands.
Okay. Thank you very much. Emily, you have a question.
I do. Yes, hello, Lydia. It's good to see you.
Hello, Emily.
And you won't be surprised that I would like to ask you about the Proust translations, and I'm putting that in the plural, because my question concerns your recent translation of the letters to his neighbors. And in the discussion yesterday, we realized that, in fact, you're changing the title to Letters to the Lady Upstairs.
If I have to jump in and say that wasn't my choice.
Oh, okay. All right. Because, right. It's so interesting because it was suggested that there was a near anagram with your name, Lydia, I, lady. Okay. But still, I still have a question, which is in my reading of them.
Let me explain first. I mean, I like the idea of that anagram. That was the English publisher. See, the American one was not that title. It was Letters to His Neighbors. And but the English wanted something more intriguing and more romantic or exciting or inviting. I wasn't crazy about it, but I usually don't make a big fuss. You know, the publisher has to sell books, and I have a certain sympathy for their point of view. And I'll just add one other wrinkle on the title. The first suggestion for the American edition was Letters to My Neighbor by Proust, and I thought that was terribly wrong because he didn't write this book. It's not his book. He didn't choose to do this. So to make it My Neighbor by Marcel Proust. So his neighbors was what we did. But anyway, I'm still curious about your question.
No, that's absolutely fascinating. I wasn't aware that there were the two different titles, as indeed for Swan as well. The edition that I have, I think, must be the British edition, where your name as translator is between two floors. on the entresol, which you take so much care to define for us in your afterword, and as your position kind of go-between translator. So my question comes back to what you've said on several occasions, that translating the novel Du Côté du Chez Swann, or that part of the novel, impacted on your writing of short stories, because after the long phrases of Proust, you wanted to write short stories which were as short as possible. And my question is, did translating the letters impact on your writing, or has it impacted on your writing in any way?
Well, that's interesting. I hadn't worked on thinking about that. I'm trying to, there's something you said, you said that about the entresol. I think that's very interesting, the entresol equivalent to the translator, the go-between. And I can't tell you how much trouble I had just researching entresol. You know, and sort of in doing that book, even though it's short and there are only 20-something letters, that involved a great deal of work, unexpected work. And I think, well, for the entresol, I was back to researching buildings in Paris in particular, which I had done for, now I'm mixing up Flaubert and Proust, one of them talks about the poor student living on the 4th floor or under the eaves. And I had to do a lot. I think I can't remember, but someone smarter than me there will remember. But I had to research buildings in Paris. But for these books, for these letters, the Proust letters, I'm afraid they were in the original French. A lot of them are not dated, so they were put in a sort of plausible order in the French edition. But when I came to translate them, that's what happens when you're translating, as opposed to just reading, and maybe even reading quickly. I began to see that they were not in the order. The French order was not the plausible order. You know, he'd mentioned visiting someone who in the previous letter had already died, that sort of thing. And so and we actually hired a researcher to help me. The two of us I can't tell you how many diagrams and how many different orders we had to research what was the most likely order. You know, when did this theater performance first debut, and when did this person die, and so on. So it wasn't so much an impact on my own writing as the fascination, which I have anyway about other things, of doing that sort of research and discovering, you know, and the answer to a riddle of that sort, you know. And then the afterword was terrific fun for me most of the way through, to go back to John's first question about writing I enjoy, and especially the end of that afterword was fun for me. The son of the people who owned the flower shop where Proust had bought his flowers, it was just lovely. So that's what I would say about that book, and also that kind of project where someone says, would you translate these 26 letters? And you say, oh, fine, 26 letters, and some of them are very short, but it took me a long time.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Excellent, thank you. There are a couple of questions that have appeared in the chat. So I'm going to read them out. And maybe the people questioning can turn on their cameras if they have like follow-up questions, or I've misunderstood the question. So the first is from Lucia Mera, and she asks, do you ever send the letters of complaint stories to the manufacturers concerned?
Yes, I do. And in fact, they, not all of them, let's see, I've done 5 or 6 or 7. And I did a very recent one. I mean, you know, it's recent and it's also published recently in the London Review of Books, called Dear Who Gives a Crap? Pardon my language, I'm very old fashioned, so crap is spelled with 2 asterisks in the middle. I sent that one, and I've sent a few of the others, and I've gotten answers to most of them. Most of them start as sincere letters of complaint. And then usually I see how absurd they are, or how pompous I am, or something about them says to me, this is a story. This is not as much a serious letter of complaint as a story. And so that's what happened with the latest Who Gives a Crap. Who Gives a Crap is a toilet paper manufacturer that does a wonderful thing that makes recycled toilet paper to avoid what shocked me to learn was cutting down virgin forests, boreal forests in Canada. So our Charmin brand toilet paper here in the US is made of virgin forest. And I was appalled. And this toilet paper company makes recycled toilet paper and also gives half its profits to build toilets, install toilets in parts of the world that don't have them. So what could be better? But I had 2 very minor complaints and wrote them a letter. And then I was delighted to see that at least one friend said that after reading my story, they looked into this company and they're now switching to this company. So I'm not sorry to promote good causes.
Whoops. Oh.
Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you. Sorry, you disappeared off my screen all of a sudden as Zoom rearranged everything.
Oh.
Okay, I've got another one in the chat, and I've got, in fact, 2 in the chat and a couple of hands raised. So one in the chat from a name that I'm going to read as VMain, but because it's somebody's screen name, says, I always think of you in relation to European literature. Would you, and if so, how would you relate your writing to the American literary tradition?
Well, I think in the beginning, when I was young, I was particularly influenced by European, literature usually of a few generations before me. Although I read deeply in American literature too, so it's hard to say. But say Kafka, the European setting and sensibility a little bit was very influential. And also I had traveled in Europe. I'd lived in Graz, Austria for a year when I was only 7. And so, and then I'd returned when I was 11, when I was 17 and younger. So it wasn't just the literature, but the life and the culture that I experienced there that had a big role for me. Then, but I'm also very American in the sense that my generations of my family have, this is distressing but unavoidable that early ancestors of mine were slave owners. I just discovered that in the last few months, because it was a branch of the family I hadn't looked into who were living in Virginia. I'm happy to say that the slave owners' immediate descendants moved away from the South and became supportive of runaway slaves, became a station on the Underground Railway. So I felt a little better about that branch of the family. Another branch was part of the Salem witch trials. She was tried as a witch and executed, and so on and so forth. So my heritage goes through all these different stages of American history, good and bad. And I've also worked with, I'm doing various projects on the writing of ancestors. One of them is converting an ancestor's memoir into a poem. It's called Our Village, and part of it has been published in magazines and also in New Directions poetry pamphlet. And I'm fascinated by the project of converting prose into a poem. And I'll add to that one critic, and it delighted me. One critic stopped saying that my work was like European work in translation and said it also belongs to the tradition of Benjamin Franklin tinkering, the sort of American tinkering, inventing and making this out of something else. I'm not putting it very well, but I really liked that idea, and that ties back into grandmother, my grandmother being a thrifty single mother, making do this out of that. So I'm, as I say, working on several projects that do involve ancestors and thereby the sort of American character. I'm afraid I go on and on. I should try to keep my answers short so I can have more questions. But I feel very American. Maybe in my youth I felt more European. And now I won't be flying anymore. I resolved last spring, or two years ago now, before the pandemic, I decided not to fly anymore because of the carbon footprint. So now my experience of Europe, until they develop electric airplanes, is going to have to be in my imagination, my memory, and remotely, sadly.
Thank you, Lydia. I've got one more question from the chat, and then there are two people with raised hands. So the question from the chat is from Isabella Torasan, and she says, thank you for being here. As somebody with a long career in translation, what advice would you give to early career translators? So people just starting out.
Gee, there's again, lots and lots of advice to give. I suppose I could advise doing what I actually never did, which was find an author you love who isn't translated or who's been just badly translated. And don't do the whole thing. I made that mistake once of translating a whole book and then discovering someone else was under contract with it. But translate a good sample, make it really good, and start showing it around to publishers. But also, there are lots and lots and lots of literary magazines out there. And, why not publish as much as you can of this beloved text, whatever it is, in literary magazines. And it doesn't, if they have to be small, most literary magazines don't pay. So you can't really expect that. But just keep trying to place them in magazines so you build up a little record of publication for this beloved text. And I'm not sure what else you can do. It's harder to, sometimes you can get recommended by someone who's already well established and they say, well, I can't do this book, but my friend so-and-so can do it. But it's a little harder to go that route. I think it's better to go the route of trying to place translations or excerpts of translations that you believe in and build up your own resume. So you could do several authors, bits of several authors and build up a case for yourself. And of course, I'm not even touching on the craft part, which is to be an absolute perfectionist and, you know, make it absolutely wonderful and reread it and show it to your friends and make sure it's as good as you can, and so on and so forth. Read in the original language. I'm leaving out a lot, but there you go. I'll stop there.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to pass the microphone, as it were, to Julie. Do you want to put your camera on and ask a question?
Hello.
I read the news that Columbia University has acquired your archive, and I was wondering if you could tell us anything about that process, what the experience was like. And I was also wondering, do you see it as a type of publication? What's it like to think about your own archive?
Well, it's complicated again. At first, I thought because of climate change, you know, people will be worrying more about getting water and food than they will about reading my old papers, you know. But I thought, okay, if they want them, they're on very high ground in Manhattan, so maybe the floodwaters won't. Now, I'm sorry to be so pessimistic, and I actually have more hope now than I did a year ago, because people are infinitely inventive and young people are very determined to save the world. So that aside, it's been a very complicated process because, and I haven't finished yet, the COVID pandemic interrupted the process and also gave me a little more time. It's one thing to put a pile of files of old business transactions or an old manuscript into a box and seal it up and give it away, but it's another thing to give away letters and give away journals. And that's been enormously complicated because it's a very, you know, I don't mind letting my notebooks go, but I want to Xerox every page of them, and I don't trust it to anyone else, and it takes a long time to Xerox all these pages. So that, and then I have to read them all first, and then that's complicated. When you mention publication, I think what's going to come out of that is that I'm going to mark passages and begin publishing excerpts from notebooks, because when there's certain examples, like Peter Handke's The Weight of the World is just a volume of excerpts from his notebooks, undated, but they're full of wonderful observations and interesting little bits. And I'm hoping that enough of mine will be interesting so that I can do that, select from different volumes of the notebooks and put together excerpts and publish those. And then otherwise they'll probably be restricted for 20 years. I still have to debate about that, you know. I don't care if this comes out, but will my husband care? Will my children care? You know, and then you get to grandchildren and say, well, I know they won't care. So you have to figure how many years you need to restrict them, or if you don't at all. So the notebooks and the letters are two problems. You know, the letters are full of fascinating stuff. Now, do I want to read them all first? There are a lot of them, and make notes, and then, so it's a very complicated process, and it'll take me many more months, I think, to get on top of that.
Okay, thank you, Lydia. I've got one more question in the chat, but I want to go to Lynn's second iPad first. I'm assuming, Lynn, do you want to put your camera on and ask the question?
Hi.
Yes. Hi. We met briefly in Arles 2 years ago.
Really?
And I'm really, yes. In fact, no, I asked if I could get a picture taken with you at the end of one of your conferences. The question I'm going to ask you today, in fact, is what you said in one of your essays, in Essays 1, about how your short forms come out like a breath. which is just lovely. So are there perfect breaths? And for the breaths that aren't perfect, how much time do you spend? How do you decide that it's good enough to go on the page and be published in very short forms?
Yeah, that's difficult too. Very few of them come out absolutely finished with the title finished. You know, that's rare. That the body of the short text might be there, you know, perfect right away, but the title might take some figuring out. Right now, I'm preparing a submission to a magazine and gathering all the very short. They happen to be all very short pieces. I don't always write very short. And the process now, see, when you ask if it's, how do I decide if it's good enough, that's very difficult, because these are what I would consider borderline, but then someone else might look at one of them and say, oh, that's profoundly moving to me or something. Whereas I thought this just barely makes it from say a good journal entry to a finished story. And there's a sort of line between those two things. But the process is really, in this case anyway, I keep coming back to the stories. So I'll isolate 15 stories maybe, or more. And some of them pulled from notebooks that I'm going through for the archive. You know, I'll find a story just about ready-made there that I wrote a long time ago, but there it is. And I'll type them up and I'll, you know, on the computer, and then I'll come back to them, you know, a week later or 2 weeks later or a month later, and usually something immediately occurs to me. Okay, this sentence is wrong, and this is how it should be. And sometimes it's not quite as quick and easy as that. So I keep trying to make them better and better and better, and then get to a certain point, I say, well, are they good enough to show somebody? And then I try to give the magazine more than enough so they can sort of not publish the ones that they consider, either they consider borderline, or they don't like, or they don't have room for, or they, you know, I said only 10, so they take the 10 they like the best. So it's not an easy thing. Some are obviously good to me, you know, and finished, and some are borderline, as I said.
And for the borderline ones, when you rediscover them in your collections, do you think, oh, if I had to do it again, I'd change something? Or once they're out there, do you decide you've gone for it? And
yeah, once they're out there, I've really read them so many times, you know, getting them ready to submit and so on, that I'm pretty sure of them. In one case, I tried to revise a story after it was out, and a good reader that I showed it to said, oh, no, it was perfect the way it was. You know? So fine, you know, you can't, you know, everybody will have different opinions anyway. So.
Okay, thank you very much.
You're welcome. And Arles is one of the most interesting cities I know, and I've written a long piece about it that will end the second book of essays.
Oh, wonderful.
Most of the essays are about translation or learning foreign languages, but I wanted to end with this long piece about Arles.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. We're running out of time, so I'm going to make this the last question. It is quite a long question, though. So
maybe we'll have to close after that.
Elena, do you want to speak it yourself now that you're on camera, or would you like me to? You want me to read it? Okay. So this question is from Elena, and she says, hi, and thank you for being here. In relation to an earlier discussion, I was wondering how you would feel about a feminist reading of some of your stories. Given the fact that there are some feminist and post-feminist concerns in your stories, such as equality, motherhood relationships, mother-daughter relations, different generations of women, and so on. And given the fact that you seem to be resisting the label of a feminist or a woman writer, could you talk to us about your feelings about feminism and classifications of your work?
Yeah, it's a tricky question. I mean, I'm a feminist in the sense of all that I believe, all that feminists believe. I've never just put that label on myself, partly because I haven't specifically agitated for feminist causes or written with that in mind. And in fact, I don't write with anything in mind. I write to please myself, and the stories come out of whatever my preoccupations are, just have developed over time. So I have developed certain beliefs about women, about men, about relationships. I grew up in a household with, I wouldn't even call my mother a feminist, and yet I'm very pleased. Here we go back to the archive again. I was reading her letters written in 1941 when she was working as a freelance writer and reporter. She was reporting on a trial in Washington, and she was the only woman at the press table. And she was leaving my father home with her first child. It wasn't even his child. Now, you know, he didn't have sole care. He had help in the house, which was sort of normal back then, even if you didn't have a large income. So it wasn't him doing it all by himself. But in the letters, she's saying, well, I may have to be here another week, or, you know, I want to come home. He says, please come home soon. But so she was, that was very unusual, or it was fairly unusual. And she was a freelance writer and always took it for granted. So their relationship was, you know, they were both writing. He was also a professor, but they were both writing. And one of the common things I would experience or witness would be one of them reading or giving the other something to read. And then everyone had to be very quiet while the other read this and then gave the comments. So in that sense, my father was very respectful of her work and respectful of my work as a girl growing up. So I was in a household where it was taken for granted, this kind, so there was no need to go out and work for it. It was right there in the house. And I suppose that's why I grew up assuming I could do this or that. That's not to say I didn't run into, you know, some prejudice as a woman, but not a whole lot, I mean, as a female. And so what do I want to say? So whatever comes, I don't mind the stories, some of the stories say being regarded as feminist, except that it was never my agenda. It was never my political aim. As I say, the stories give equal place to men and women, I think. And sometimes actually I wrote as a man for some reason. I thought that's what this feels like the Sketches for a Life of Wassily is about a man who's actually me. And there are others like that. Sometimes, so the gender is sort of fluid. Sometimes a man, sometimes she doesn't know what she is. I think there's one story called Who She Was or Who I Am or something. So the gender is fluid in many of the stories. The thinking is gender indeterminate, I think, not very womanly or manly. I don't know. What else can I say about that? And I sometimes think about it specifically, you know, I mean, I pick up a book that's by a man. I don't feel I have to read a lot of books by women more than men, but I'm very aware of it. Like in one of my book clubs, we're reading Don Quixote. I insisted on reading Don Quixote because we're reading part of it. We're not reading the whole thing because I'd never read it. And the introduction to the book is by Harold Bloom, even though the translator is Edith Grossman, and he refers to her, but otherwise in the note, he speaks only of men. men in literature, men in criticism. And I notice those things and I don't like them. And I talk about them. I don't know, I'm just sort of answering by talking around the subject. But I guess it just comes back to, if my agenda was feminist and I wrote stories that were delivering a feminist message on purpose, I would call myself a feminist, but I don't, as I say, I don't think ahead of time about a story I want it to convey this or that or the other. It conveys what it conveys because of who I am. And the one more example, and then I'll stop talking. When I wrote the story, The Cows, about the cows across the road from me, this is not feminism now, but animal rights. I didn't write that with an agenda either. I was looking at the cows, noticing them, appreciating them, observing them closely. And that story developed over 3 years of just observing them. And then after it was out, I thought, well, that could be, I didn't write it with this purpose of it being an animal rights manifesto, but it is showing great respect for animals. And that comes from my profound belief that we should be respectful for all living creatures. And so if it's taken as a vote for that, then I'm glad. But that's the interpretation that comes after I write it spontaneously. And that's why I appreciate all your studies or talks or attendance here, because it's the interpretation that comes after the writing that actually belongs to someone else usually. So thank you. Thanks for your question, Elena.
Thank you very much, Lydia. And I think that's a wonderful point to end. Jean-Michel, I know you want to take the floor and conclude.
Yes, thank you, John. Lydia, thank you very much. It was a pleasure to see you and to hear you. And if I can, it is as pleasant to listen to you as it is to read you, because in both cases, you're the same person. And it doesn't happen so often with the writer. It's very precious for me and for us all, I think. So thank you very much. I suppose many of us want to meet you again before a long time, for real or for virtual, but we all continue to read you with interest and delight, I can assure you. So thank you very much again for having been here with us today, really.
Well, thank you in turn for paying such nice attention, and I'm sure I will read some of the papers in the future.
For sure, yeah. We'll keep in touch around this project. Yes, of course.
Good. Thank you
Yeah.
for everyone for coming. Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you to everybody, to Emil Hills and John Evans, to the speakers, to the audience for the interest they have in Lydia Davis' work. Thanks to you. In my opinion, it was really a very interesting conference with stimulating high-level talks and papers. It has been very interesting to hear all for me, really. So thank you very much to you. Joe, perhaps you wish to add a word?
Thank you. No, just to say thanks to everyone for their brilliant papers, and thanks to the audience for their participation in the discussions. It's been a really fascinating couple of days, and I've learned a lot. And it's been brilliant to have Lydia Davis herself here as well. So no, thank you all, and thanks to Lydia for joining us.